All right, guys, so today's whiteboard talk, we're going to talk about muscle fiber types and how you should train with them. Emily inside the group had a very good question. She was asking, how should we alter our training, or how should we train different body parts depending on the muscle fiber type? So if you guys are unaware, there are two types of muscle fibers: fast and slow twitch, or type 1 slow twitch, type 2 fast twitch. This is basically the idea of a bodybuilding style muscle, if that makes sense, versus a sprinter muscle. So this is a good example, actually. One of the only muscles that has and I'm going to go into this in more detail, a very dominant difference is the hamstrings. A lot of them are pretty evenly spread, which I'm going to get into. But for example, the hamstrings are 70% type 2. Type 2 is fast twitch. If you look at a sprinter, they don't lift a lot of weights. They sprint, they're explosive, they go short distances, but it's very hard, explosive, and fast contractions. Type 2, they have huge legs. This is why. A bodybuilder has to do heavy Romanian deadlifts for like 5 to 7 reps, for example, to really grow his hamstrings because they're a type 2 fiber. So as we look at this, there's a few things to remember, but basically what we're looking at is every single muscle has a mix of both. They used to say a lot before they really dug into science and started doing studies and biopsies on people's muscles. They would just kind of say, like, oh, chest is predominantly slow twitch, so you should do high reps, or this and that. But what they found out is almost every single muscle group, as you can see, is really even. Which means, number one, this is splitting hairs. We shouldn't be focusing on this that much. And number two, we should be doing just as much high rep work as we should be doing low rep work if we want to enhance the size or definition of our muscle. So if we look at these, the pecs or the chest, this is the muscle, just so you guys understand where this is going. Fiber type is split by type 1 and type 2. So on the left column, we have type 1. On the right, we have type 2. Again, type 1 is slow twitch. That would be the equivalent of doing light to moderate weight for 12, 15, 20 high rep work. Type 2 is fast twitch. It's going to respond better to explosive or really strength-based, strength-dominant work. So low rep, thinking 1 rep, 3 rep, 5 rep work. So really heavy loads, and that's type 2. So as we go down this, pecs are 40-60. So this makes sense because trying to get a bigger chest, a bigger pecs, more development there, you're going to want to do some heavy bench pressing. Everybody knows that. That's why the bench press is such a compound movement. It's because it's predominantly, that muscle group is predominantly type 2, but not by much. 40-60, the split is almost even. The lats, 50-50, they're split right in half. The traps, 65-45. So again, this is pretty even. There's a lot of people that have big traps just from doing heavy deadlifts, heavy carries, just heavy work in general, because the traps are a supportive muscle for the shoulders. But what studies have shown is 65% of the trap itself is type 1 fiber dominant, which means we should be doing high rep face pulls, posterior flies, shrugs. You guys in the group know from my programming, I program a lot of trap and upper back work because it's such a good injury prevention muscle. It's going to support your shoulders. It's going to prevent injuries in your compound lifts. But it's 65% type 1. But still, pretty even. You're going to get gains from both ways. Biceps, 45-55. So this is why a lot of Olympic lifters, a lot of power lifters, and a lot of gymnasts have huge and ripped biceps, but they don't do any curls. They're doing heavy lifts that are rowing dominant or ring chin-ups. These are heavy rows and backwards, but the bicep is a secondary movement, a secondary mover for those movement patterns. And because of this dominance in type 2, that heavy work is going to contribute to bigger biceps. But a lot of times we do high rep curls because, again, it's pretty even spread, and too heavy of curls is going to bang up your elbows. Triceps, 35-65. So similar to the biceps, but it's a little bit more type 2 dominant, which means heavy work. But again, this is why we don't need to do a ton of tricep work if you're doing heavy overhead press and heavy bench press, because the tricep is a supportive muscle for pressing movements. Quads, 50-50. You're going to get gains from high rep and low rep work. Glutes are actually 70-30, which tells us these are going to grow best from doing high rep, high volume, hip thrusts, abductions, glute bridges, things like that, but in the high rep, because the glutes are predominantly type 1 fibers. But again, you're still going to get some gains. Hamstrings, complete opposite from the glutes, which means heavy work, sprints, hill sprints, explosive running and jumping, things like that. That's going to be the best way to grow your hamstrings. Deltoids, 60-40. So they're predominantly type 1, but not by much, because this is why, again, heavy power lifters have big shoulders from pressing overhead. But for injury prevention, and because it's predominantly a slow twitch muscle group, we do want to include lateral raises, high rep presses, things like that, because tension-based movements are going to grow this muscle most. Calves, this is the most dominant of anything. 90% type 1, 90% slow twitch. This makes sense. Most of us don't need to train our calves. We walk every day, high rep work. That's also why very, very high rep, tension-based, and adding pauses at the top or the bottom of a calf raise to create more time under tension works really well for growing your calves. And it's because type 1, slow twitch, functions best off time under tension, high rep stuff, a lot of metabolite or lactic acid based work. And that makes sense because every step we take, we're technically doing a rep on our calves, so we need to stimulate it at a maximal level. And then last but not least, the abdominals. There's not a lot of hard evidence on just the abs because there's the transverse abdominis, the rectus abdominis. There's technically your erectile spinors on the back, your spinal erectors on the back are going to be part of your core. Your obliques are part of your core, and it varies muscle to muscle across your whole entire torso. Serratus anterior, all these things are technically your core. So your abs are pretty 50-50. They're all different. They're going to get a lot of gains from doing heavy compound lifts on these other groups, but then also doing some high rep stuff like sit-ups. The main point I wanted to get across to you guys here is, number one, it doesn't matter as much as people make it think. Studies have shown the best benefit for every single muscle group, no matter what the dominance is going to be to split your reps and sets and volume and everything to intensity, frequency in half. Meaning, and you guys see this a lot in the elite programs, we might have a day where we go 5x5 deadlift, glute dominant movement, or 4x6 to 8 reps hip thrust. That's a heavy type 2 slow twitch exercise to stimulate glutes. The next day we hit the glutes on another leg day, we might be doing 3 sets of 15 to 20, a type 1 dominant set. We're doing both because every single muscle is going to be split almost evenly. All the main muscles we're trying to grow, they're going to be split pretty evenly. So you're going to get more benefit out of actually splitting up your training both ways versus only doing type 2 dominant stuff because the hamstrings are predominantly type 2. The next thing with this, genetics play a major role. This is what we see on average, but there's actually genetic differences in people, from genetic as in from when we were born, but also epigenetic based on our environment over time. So our genetics change. That's what epigenetics are. What that means is I was born with a predisposition to be more type 1. I don't know because I haven't had a muscle biopsy. But let's say I was predominantly type 1. That means in general, all of my muscles are probably going to do better on that type of training. And we can learn this by trying different programs, seeing what works best for us. That's how you can tell. But over time, how we train, how we sleep, our stress dominance, how often we go into parasympathetic versus sympathetic. Now they're even showing the type of foods we eat can play a role in muscle fiber type. These things happen over time and they can alter our muscle fiber type. So again, there's another reason why we shouldn't look too closely into this. The third thing to consider is basically after you've done both, you've understood that this is splitting hairs, you shouldn't be focusing on this completely, then you can begin to prioritize just a little bit. And what I mean by that is what you'll notice inside the elite programs, again, for example, and I'm going to use the hamstrings again because they're so type 2 dominant. I might have a day where we're doing heavy RDLs or a single leg RDL or an anterior lunge or something very hamstring dominant for 4 or 5 reps. The next day I might go higher rep, like I said, splitting it up, but it might only be 8 reps. So I'm really just going on the upper end of that type 2 dominant movement pattern or that type 2 dominant rep range. The big point here, guys, is we should be balancing almost everything. Almost every single muscle is split pretty evenly, and because of that, we want to have a balance. This is kind of splitting hairs at the end of the day, but it can give you some insights of how your muscles are going to grow. So what I would leave you guys with, my last tip here is try your best to split everything up, But if there's any muscle you see on this list that you specifically have a weakness in, you have an imbalance in, or you just physically want to see the aesthetics grow and get more developed, that is when you go into creating a fiber type dominance within your program. That's when you look at, maybe you're inside the elite and you notice that, the glute work isn't all type 2, but that's your number one muscle you want to grow. In that case, what you would do is you would prioritize that, and you can tag me in the group and ask me, how can I change this program to make it more type 2 dominant for my glutes? Pick one muscle to specialize on and put this focus and emphasis on that muscle. Otherwise, it's almost split down the middle, and you should be prioritizing both type 1 and type 2 for every single muscle group. And they've done studies to show that that's going to be the best way to go about your training.